To clean or treat an old shore is often about making a difficult trade-off or decision to ensure there are no consequential harm from operational activities. Treatments are to be feasible and the response costs are to be kept reasonable. This model explains that SCAT is about scaling and integrating as a multidisciplinary science supported by local knowledge and experience. Explored are the core interests engaged government agencies and coastal communities and the response party that makes SCAT a dynamic social process. The module explores trade-offs by explaining the concepts of the net environmental benefit analysis and reasonable costs and their interrelationships. Both are terms you will hear often in a SCAT dialogue with agencies and the responsible parties. Covered is the importance and application of natural recovery, also referred to as attenuation, as a benchmark in SCAT decisions, with a few studies that support this premise. A common outcome is when old shores are left for natural recovery or even after the treatment. Some residual oil can still remain, resulting in unmitigated impact to our shore's ecologies and values. Examine is what this means in the SCAT process insofar as natural resource damage assessment and restoration. These are after-the-fact aspects of SCAT. This module takes about 40 minutes to complete.
For a shore protection program inclusive of SCAT, one of the most important concepts to get your head around is net environmental benefit analysis, otherwise referred to by the acronym NEBA. The key takeaway with net environmental benefit analysis is whether or not to make the decision to clean or treat an old shore. And if the decision is to do so, then why, when, how, and to what level. It is not just about getting rid of the stranded oil. That is, just removing oil is not a performance measure of a shore protection program. There's more to it than that. From an ecological perspective, achieving a net environmental benefit is to minimize the severity of environmental damage, both from the oil as well as from operations, as well as to enhance the recovery of a damaged ecosystem. That is, to promote natural recovery. Also referred to as natural attenuation, where there's no human intervention. Later in this module, we'll see how response costs come into play, but let's explore net environmental benefit analysis further. The standard definition of net benefit analysis is a bit of a brain teaser. Let's give it a go. Net benefit analysis is a quantitative comparative analysis technique that aims to decrease the overall harm of spilled oil on ecological, cultural, and commercial resources and their value whilst achieving acceptable mitigation and ensure overall positive benefit. These are really the outcomes of the two objectives to minimize the severity of environmental damage and to enhance the recovery of damaged ecosystems. In actual practice, this is done by the field SCAT working within the oiled shore environments, collaborating and determining whether or not a shoreline should be cleaned up, and if so, how, when, and to what level. The key challenge with working with operations is showing that the metric for spill response is net environmental benefit. It's not about how much oil you get off the shore or how fast. As achieving a net environmental benefit is such an important part of the SCAT process, and for getting buy-in on when, what, and how shores will be assessed and treated if required, the following are some important tenets. The tenets of both net benefit analysis and the SCAT processes are that they're perceived as transparent and equitable by the responding community, provided collaboratively and inclusively with coastal users, agencies, and the responsible party, that they're based on science, experience, and local knowledge, delivered in a structured and timely way, undertaken by qualified and representative people, viewed as pragmatic, proven, and reasonable. One must also consider secondary consequences of treatment options, such as the amount of oily waste generated, as well as responder safety and comfort, as shoreline cleanup can be laborious and done in unfavorable weather conditions. These tenets are addressed and reinforced throughout this course. Let's take a look at the net environmental benefit analysis drivers. In a very general sense, they are the coastal community, government agencies, and the responsible party. What makes a conversation of what is or isn't a course of action that will achieve a net environmental benefit is challenging to agencies, communities, and the responsible party. They each have different perspectives and interests. Coastal communities want emotional wholeness. They want to get back to what the world was like before the incident. Agencies often want to focus on ensuring that response is legally done under permits and that all decisions are scientifically sound and supportable. A responsible party, such as a ship owner who's paying the bills under the polluter pay principle, wants the response to be practical and cost effective. Regardless of the differences, for each oil shore you need to make a credible, consensus-based decision of whether to leave the oil shore for natural recovery or treat it. This will be repeated over and over again for every shore segment within an impacted area. It's important to stick to the tenets. An oil shore will often recover naturally and sooner than social impacts related to uncertainty and unfairness. SCAT is a very multidisciplinary undertaking. It requires scaling, that is looking at the big picture going down to the small details that you would find on the shore, then integrating all your findings and putting them together for a treatment plan should it be required. To explore this concept, let's look at Beale Cove on Langara Island in the main island of Haida Gwaii, located in British Columbia, Canada, and the Shoreline Unit 31, which is a sandy beach. As one zooms into the Google Earth image, you realize that this tiny beach will be influenced by the Pacific Ocean and its temperate waters. There are major currents that surround Langara Island that are rich in nutrients. This is evident by world-class salmon fishing in that area. As you zoom or scale closer, you'll see that there are passages that stir up these currents, providing the nutrients to a wide variety of other marine organisms like shellfish and kelp bed. These resources have been providing subsistence to the Haida First Nations for thousands of years and continues to do so. This is evident from a First Nations village site upland to the beach. Right away you know that there's commercial, ecological, and cultural values in this area that need to be protected. Beale Cove and its beach is quite exposed to the open waters of the Pacific Ocean, which can result in changing beach profiles from winter to summer. Now, as one is actually standing on the shore, you realize that it's made up of sand, which can be quite mobile and cover any oil deposits, such as during a storm event. The sand will have a low penetration of heavy oil, but a little bit more so with a light diesel oil. Now getting on your hands and knees and start digging, you find that the sand overlays bedrock, which will limit oil penetration. As this scenario shows, there is a lot of integration and interpretation that needs to go on to determine the best course of action should this shoreline be oiled. The more intermediate and advanced courses in geomorphology, biology, archaeology, and oceanography all come to play in scaling and integrating. This is why it takes time to fully assess a shore, even if there's no oil, such as doing pre-SCAT. The net environmental benefit analysis process engages three activities: collecting, predicting, and comparing. Collecting is done by the field SCAT. While on oiled shores, it's about measuring the oil's distribution, its thickness. You're assessing the ecological vulnerabilities and sensitivity to the oil, addressing the human uses, whether it's cultural site for First Nations or has commercial applications like a shellfish harvesting site. This is where local knowledge from the representative SCATs come into play. If you choose to undertake a shoreline treatment, then you have to identify what kind of constraints that operations have to undertake so as not to cause more environmental harm from the actual cleanup activities than the oil itself. Probably the most difficult part of the NEBA process is determining when cleanup treatments should end. What should be the end points? What should be the point in which closure on the shoreline will be achieved? While still on shore, you're predicting based on previous case histories and experience what's the likely or socioeconomic impacts. This is where experience comes into play, as well as supported by scientific studies. Then you start to compare the advantages and disadvantages of different shoreline treatment options, which includes natural recovery. This gathered information in the form of measurements and annotations and photographs are then reflected in the environmental unit to come up with a final recommendation to unified command on what course of action would be taken on that shoreline. Net environment benefit analysis is a bit abstract thinking. There is more to consider, such as the effort and cost for any kind of treatment measure being considered. The concept of reasonable cost is explored in the next few slides. This slide provides a little bit more concrete example of net environmental benefit analysis by looking at the fundamental considerations for each response measure and for each oiled shore being assessed. First is knowing what to do. What are your response options? The benchmark is natural recovery. The oiled shore may have high wave exposure that allows for natural cleaning. The situation may be oiled marsh grasses, in which operations will cause more harm than the actual oil itself. If a treatment option is being considered, it will depend on the shoreline's geomorphology, its sediment, wave exposure, what ecological resources are present, and more. These options could include manual removal, to shoreline cleaning agents, to ambient water deluge, and more. Treatments and their applicability are advanced level of SCAT training. Once a treatment measure or a combination of measures have been determined, the next step is to determine what not to do. These are the response constraints directed to operations. Examples would be: do not walk on muddy estuary flats and drive the oil into the mud. Don't use or stage heavy equipment in the uplands because there's culturally sensitive resources in that area. Response or operational constraints are very important in achieving a net environmental benefit because you do not want to do more harm than the oil itself. It's important to define when work will be completed in a way that operations will understand. These are referred to as endpoints. Examples would be: cease shore water flushing once no black or brown oil has been observed in the water, or cease treatments once oil coat on shore has been reached. Developing endpoints, again, is an advanced level of SCAT training. The defined endpoint of how much oil is removed, or in some cases left on shore, has to be to the satisfaction of the coastal community, government agencies, and those that have a legitimate and vested interest in the use of that shore. After a treatment has been undertaken, the shoreline has to be revisited and everybody has to agree on that work has been completed. This is the sign-off. Sign-off is required for each shore that is assessed for its oiling as well as for its treatment. if required. This shore-by-shore process is the way in which we achieve the final closure of a marine oil spill incident. This is a short video that summarizes net environmental benefit analysis, but it also explains that net environmental benefit analysis also applies to other aspects of oil spill response, in particular the use of dispersants or undertaking in situ oil burning.
Net environmental benefit analysis, or NEBA, is a process used by the response community for making the best choices to minimize impacts of oil spills on people and the environment. Before a spill occurs, NEBA requires the identification and prioritization of environmental and community assets based upon environmental sensitivities and social values. Outcomes are predicted by reviewing and comparing previous spill cases, including restoration considerations, to understand potential impacts. During the NEBA process, environmental and social impacts are weighed to determine effective oil spill response tools and balance trade-offs. NEBA also establishes plans and puts pre-approvals in place to support environmental and social values. NEBA, or the Net Environmental Benefit Analysis, allows proactive pre-selection and planning to inform a response. This improves organization, communication with the community, and plays a critical role in protecting the environment.
For an oil shoreline that is selected for treatment, the issue is not necessarily what type of treatment would be required, but what level of treatment would be needed. What would be the endpoint that no further treatment would be required? These are two terms that you need to know in SCAT and become familiar with. Technically, the problem is knowing when to stop oil treatments so you're not causing more harm. Financially, the issue becomes you don't want to spend more money than you have to. A reasonable cost, which is explored later in this module. But more importantly, it's to manage expectations. The more stringent the endpoint, say from leaving a thin layer of oil on rocky substrate compared to no visible oil, the more things that needs to come to play and be considered. There are more issues, challenges, and trade-offs. Examples of residual oil that might be seen on shore or in water that can be viewed as an endpoint where no further treatment is required are an oil coat or an oil stain on rocks or substrates, or in the case of water, oil stains or no visible oil in either situations. As one becomes more stringent or trying to meet higher expectations, factors that need to be considered are the increased cost, additional environmental damage, getting into relying on analytical measurements, especially if you want to see no oil present at all, reduce operational flexibility, and in the end, there can be conflicts with expectations. The identification of standardized naming of endpoints is an advanced level of SCAT training. This is the most complex slide of the course. It explains the relationship between the net environmental benefit analysis and the recovery rule. You're going to hear some environmental economics 101 to explain it. Why is the net environmental benefit and the recovery rule so important to the SCAT process? It's because they are the two cornerstones of industry and government policy, in that there should be no further harm done by mitigation measures. That is, there's a net environmental benefit achieved. And second, that the mitigation measures are of a reasonable cost insofar as being efficient, effective, proven, and pragmatic. Oil spill impact mitigations such as shore treatments need to be as low as reasonably practicable. That reduces the ecological impacts as well as the response costs. This requirement is often referred to by the acronym ALARP. Take a look at the graph to the right, beginning with mitigation efficiency. That's the blue line. When oil is first on the water and is recovered by oil skimming vessels, the mitigation efficiencies are high. You're gathering a lot of oil for a little bit of effort. One is working at the left and top part of the blue line. As oil becomes stranded on shore, the efficiency and the amount of return for effort are reduced. An example is flushing heavily oiled sediment shores with water. This gets rid of the bulk oil, which is generally effective. You're about midway into the blue line now. But if cleaning to a higher endpoint by manual efforts such as sorbents or steam to recover the last remaining oil, the return for effort, that is the mitigation, becomes much lower. The level of effort for return could be viewed as too expensive and therefore unreasonable. You're now at the right side, bottom part of the blue line. Now take a look at the red line that depicts environmental damage is increasing with treatment effort. When recovering any kind of mobile oil on water, there's generally little environmental damage, as shown by the left side, bottom of the red line. But as one moves to the shoreline and stranded oil, water flushing has some impacts, but it's still a very gentle form of mitigation, insofar that a shoreline's ecology is not disrupted, such as impacting shellfish beds. You're somewhere in the middle of the red line. When one goes to mechanical removal of oil or using heated water, the environmental damage can be much higher depending on the flora fauna of the shoreline being treated. You're now at the right top part of the red line. So what is the optimal level of mitigation? An optimal level is where the mitigation efficiency, as a reasonable cost, transacts with the environmental damages, the net environmental benefit. This is the theoretical optimum. In practice, it's actually much more coarser and more subjective to try to reach that level. Let's interpret this graph further. To the graph's left, the area under the red line represents the amount of mitigation achieved for trying to meet the guiding policy of no further harm and reasonable cost. To the graph's right, the area under the blue line represents the residual environmental damages by abiding by these guidelines. Consequently, striving for the recovery rule and net environmental benefit can lead to unmitigated residual environmental ecological impacts that require some compensation to redress for their lost goods and services. The ramification is something that all SCAT members must keep in mind when assessing and determining shoreline treatment methods, its intensity, and its endpoints. When you walk away from assessed shore, always ask yourself and your SCAT team members, what are the residual impacts? The loss of services such as harvesting or recreation, and for how long? This is where compensation for natural resource damages come into play. Compensation being a monetary award for those residual damages and loss of goods and services. The award is provided to the stewards and the people that incur the harm. Residual oil left on shores and compensation for the loss of goods and services addresses the last part of the SCAT process equation, which is equity or fairness. This slide summarizes the output of the SCAT process insofar as a decision on what to do with an old shore, if anything. The application of as low as reasonably practical and the net environmental benefit leads to and defines the best management practices for an old shore. on how to treat or clean, as well as to do nothing, leading to natural recovery. These principles and practices aid in natural recovery, but they can still lead to residual, unmitigated ecological impacts and the loss in goods and services of an old shore, even after treatment. The three components of ALRP, NEBA, and BMP do not actually restore the environment. Restoration consideration is an aspect of post-incident impact monitoring and assessment studies. However, the SCAT field measurements and shoreline treatments provide the foundational information in which to begin and to address restoration. Restoration in the form of repairing, enhancing, or replacing the ecological harm and its value can be left to the responsible party or be part of a compensation award, managed jointly by the resource steward agencies as well as the communities that suffered the harm. SCAT field data and its documentation can be used to support the goal of a natural resource damage assessment, commonly known by the acronym NRDA. Natural resource damage assessment process and products are designed to make the public and communities whole for its injury to or loss of natural resources and the services provided by those resources. These services go beyond the market-valued ones such as commercial harvesting and fishing to include the more intangible values such as recreational, spiritual, and just basic enjoyment of the shorelines that were oiled. Your SCAT decisions on what courses of action to take or leaving for natural recovery, they will often have a very big determination of both the degree and duration of the loss of goods and services to a community. Since compensation for unmitigated or residual losses from an oil spill, even after treatment, or because of leaving to natural recovery, is a matter of equity, some countries like the United States have a well-developed natural resource damage assessment program. Their programs inclusive of assessment teams, ecological and monetary evaluations, having resource trustee committees inclusive of the affected communities and First Nations, and other procedures to make sure that the money is spent fairly and appropriately. Regardless of whether your country has a natural resource damage assessment policy and programs, the SCAT process during a marine oil spill, in particular its transparency, collaboration, and findings, can still be used in the court of law to negotiate a compensation award. Okay, how do we get to a net environmental benefit? Well, it takes the right people doing the correct work in a collaborative, transparent, and trusting way. One needs both technical and social skills. One also needs to respect and recognize who has the highest stake, who holds the coastal values. So you need to be conversant and skilled in understanding fate and effect of different oils within different environments, such as substrates, temperatures, and exposures. Using coastal resource inventory and oil sensitivity mapping. Knowing geomorphology and ecological aspects of oil shores, whether they're rocky shores, estuaries, mixed sediments. Knowing shore treatment options and their secondary impacts. Engaging First Nations and other community members for local knowledge and interest. And then meeting agency and First Nations mandates, rights, and titles. The more technical aspects of SCAT, such as knowing how to read a shore for its geomorphology and ecological sensitivities and vulnerability to oil, knowing its treatment options that may be applicable given that type of shoreline's environment, how to standardize endpoints where no further treatment is required, are all advanced SCAT training. There are three terms that are commonly spoken when communicating to operations or representatives or stakeholders. These are treat, clean, and restore. Treat, or treatments, is the technical term used by SCAT. Treatments can include flushing sediment, stranded oil, or the manual removal oil with rakes and shovels. The term clean is just the colloquial term for the above. However, to restore or restoration is a very specific measure taken after treating and or cleaning to replace or replicate the lost ecological goods and services. Try to use the correct term in the right context, but don't be too pedantic. Not all oiled shores require treatment or cleaning. Coastal shores generally have a high natural recovery capacity and capability to repair from oiling. Factors that determine a stranded oil's duration on shore are wave exposure and substrate, and then the amount and type and weathering of oil. It is important not to create work when it's not really needed. There are reasons besides just cost, such as shore cleaning of stranded oil can expose workers to unsafe situations, such as oil vapor, slips, trips, and falls. It can take away limited resources where response is most needed. One is creating oily waste, which in itself has costs and ecological consequences in its management. Natural recovery, or attenuation, both its duration and locations, are the starting point for SCAT assessments on whether to treat or to what level to promote the more timely and thorough natural recovery after treatment. As such, shoreline remediation by natural processes is the benchmark to compare environmental impacts and cleanup treatment options. The next few slides will explore this topic with a few examples. This case study about natural recovery is about the Silang Dang IU incident that occurred in December in Unalaska Islands of the Aleutian Island chains within Alaska. Due to grounding and then breaking up, this cargo vessel released much of its heavy bunker fuel. For this particular shore segment, it was exposed to high wave energy that can move its beach sediments, even the heavy cobbles. Over the winter, the oil was floated off and ground off the rocks, as shown by the before and after images. Natural recovery can also occur for oil-covered bedrock cliffs and platforms if there's enough sustained and extensive wave action. Wave action can be viewed as nature's wash machine. A significant focus of SCAT field teams is on the interaction of wave energy and shoreline type. The next case study is a spill in a much different environment. In 2006, the Westward Annette cargo vessel, while leaving its terminal, struck a pylon that ruptured its bunker fuel tanks. During the high tide, the oil heavily contaminated the marsh grass of the Squamish River estuary of Howe Sound, British Columbia. These were protected waters insofar as wave energy. However, the nearby Squamish River, with its high glacial silt content, was very effective in stripping the oil off the vegetation. The removed oil particles then will biodegrade in the water in a process called flocculation. One could see this happening over several tidal cycles as the silt-laden water washed over the vegetation. The heavily silted water, as well as the flocculation process, was the silver lining in this response. It was much more of a gentle way for natural cleaning compared to having workers trampling the marsh grass while cutting, bagging, and removing the oiled vegetation. The recommendation from the field SCAT was that there be no further treatment of the oiled grass within much of this marshland. For the final case study, we're going to go back to Alaska and revisit the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil tanker incident in Alaska. This case study shows that even a heavily oiled shore can recover over time, even those that are in protected waters. A section of shore that was not cleaned after the spill had a particularly large rock called the Burns Rock, located in the intertidal zone of Snug Harbor on Knight Inlet, Prince William Sound. This border was located in protected rocky shores that was heavily oiled. It has and continues to be a long-term study that began in 1990 to look at the natural recovery of its flora and fauna, such as algae, limpets, and other marine life that was growing on the rock. The time series of photographs shows that after 15 months, there was basically no oil visible on that rock. However, what really stands out is showing the natural variation seasonally in the biological growth and productivity. As such, there are two factors to consider if leaving oil on shore for natural recovery. The first is, how long does one want to forego the goods and services provided by the shore before it was oiled, and incurred ecological impacts when oiled? What would be considered about Marin's Rock and its surrounding shoreline, whether there was commercial interests such as shellfish harvesting, or social ones such as it was in a park and used by recreational tourists, cultural such as by First Nations undertaking rowan kelp gathering, or within a clam garden, or an ecological consideration such as an important spawning area. The second consideration pertains to restoration. There's often a desire to have oiled shores return to their former productivity and diverse state, but it's overshadowed by natural seasonal variation, as seen by these time series. Natural seasonal and ecological variation both in abundance and distribution applies whether left for natural recovery or treatment was undertaken, essentially a moving target. As such, when you're undertaking SCAT fieldwork, you're only getting a snapshot in time about the ecology of a shoreline. Undertaking pre-SCAT fieldwork, as well as combining with local knowledge, provides somewhat of a benchmark of what the biological productivity and diversity of a shoreline was before an oiling occurrence. To wrap up, here's a short net environmental benefit summary. SCAT is a program that maximizes and promotes natural recovery. While you're considering the extent, duration, and type of environmental impacts, the likelihood of cleanup to cause greater harm than the oil alone, and looking at opportunities to use natural processes to hasten recovery that includes no treatment. You hear one more rule that gets kicked around in the SCAT program, and it's called the rule of minimum regret. It's about never being in the position of having to say, we should not have done that, or we're sorry. This can occur when one doesn't fully appreciate natural recovery of an old shore, or went ahead with treatment that resulted in more harm than the oil alone. This is where and when operational experience and science and even local knowledge merges to achieve the best course of action. Don't rush the process. In many ways, nature is much more resilient to the presence of oil than people. This is because coastal communities live with uncertainty. Nature, on the other hand, just starts healing.